Hey everybody, welcome back. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about writing automated tests for your web application, the front-end tests versus back-end tests, and why I think back-end tests are more important than front-end tests. So the idea for this video stems from a conversation that I had with another developer the other day. We're working on a web application that has a Ruby on Rails API backend and a front end that's written in JavaScript in the Vue framework. And we ran into a particular bug that we were resolving, and the idea came up, well, maybe we should add some test coverage on the front end to preempt situations like this. So we ultimately decided that it's not really necessary. So I'm going to kind of share my thoughts on how we arrived at that conclusion and why we're not going to be doing any front-end tests on that application in general. So first of all, to clarify what I'm talking about, on the back end, Ruby on Rails, it's very important that you have tests. It's actually a very good practice to do. So there are a couple of popular testing frameworks. There is RSpec, which is my favorite, and there's another one called Minitest, which is pretty much integrated into Rails, and I'd say DHH likes that one better. But whichever one you prefer, I think, is a matter of syntax. Both of these major testing frameworks for Ruby do basically the same thing. They allow you to mock up a situation with some fake data that you're using for testing and put some inputs in the system and see if that you get the correct outputs coming out. And test coverage is very useful because it'll help prevent you from introducing new bugs into your program. So let's say that you are doing some modifications to a critical business logic component. We could hypothetically say that it's like a finance application. Let's say you're like making some sort of a loan calculator or something like that. Well, you modified the core business logic of how this works, and if you made a mistake, then it's going to start popping out incorrect financial numbers for that loan, and you certainly don't want that to happen. So test coverage helps you spot those kinds of errors, which are called regressions in your program, early before they go into production. Now, on the front end, there are a few popular frameworks in JavaScript that you could use. There's Jest and Mocha.js and Jasmine, and they basically do the same thing as the Ruby versions, but they're written in JavaScript. And normally for the type of stack that I'm talking about Ruby Rails backend with a front end written in JavaScript. So you're mainly testing whether elements on the front end part of the page work properly. And you probably can test some aspects of business logic, but in the particular stack that I'm talking about, you're more likely going to have the Ruby on Rails backend doing most of the heavy lifting of how the application works and all of the data stuff, where the front end is just a presentation layer for that the user sees, and it makes all the pretty tables and stuff that the user is going to be seeing in the navigation. But the main core of the application, the data, is handled by Ruby on Rails. That's the core philosophy of how I think an application with this stack should be structured. And I'm making the assumption that for the most part, you're not going to have any business logic like calculations of any sort on the front end, that if there's a financial calculation to be done, it will send that information to the back end and get a response, and then it's just going to display it. So that's one of the assumptions that I'm making here. Now, here are some of the reasons that I think putting your business logic tests on the front end of your application are somewhat redundant and unnecessary. And the first one is that in your JavaScript, it creates extra work. So, keeping up with all of the deprecations that happen in JavaScript world and making your application up to date and making sure everything works, that's kind of a hassle enough to deal with. Now, if you have a test suite with that, you're also going to have to change the tests anytime that you make a relevant change to your front end. And, your tests are going to break. It was intentional, but if it was an intentional breakage, you're probably going to have to modify those tests as well. So it's just another step that you have to deal with in keeping your program up to date. The second reason I think front-end tests are kind of redundant is that what type of errors are you trying to catch? Are you trying to catch like some sort of an aesthetic error where a button is not showing up in the right place, or maybe not showing up at all? Or are they kind of behavioral tests? Well, for the aesthetic kind of test that you're doing, it's kind of hard to write an automated test for that, because how are you going to really know using automation whether a button is showing up in the right place? Maybe it could be done, but I think a lot of those types of errors are kind of obvious to the user, and they're going to be spotted right away. Now, when it comes to behavioral tests, a lot of that is going to be covered by your Ruby on Rails backend, the business logic test that you've already integrated into your backend. It's also possible that something breaks, like a form is not submitting right or something like that. But for the most part, I think it's okay to roll the dice in most cases like that, because if like the login form is broken, your users are going to notice right away, and ideally you're going to have some type of staging environment where you log into the application, make sure that that front end generally works before you put it into production. So I just think it's okay in a lot of cases to just acknowledge that if you have some type of front-end bug where the front end of the website is broken, somebody's going to notice it, and then you could roll it back. And the third advantage that you have in your front end, which is why you don't need tests, is if you're using Typescript. So Typescript will help you catch a lot of the types of errors that could break things, mainly the syntax errors. So JavaScript, plain JavaScript, is kind of dangerous because you could be passing the wrong values into a function, and then you get some type of an error where it can't accept those parameters, or some type of typecasting thing, or maybe you just have a typo somewhere. Tests can help you catch those sort of things, but if you're using Typescript, all of the things that have to do with the syntax and typos and stuff will be caught early on. So Typescript will ensure that whatever variables you're passing into a function are correct for that function to process. And that eliminates a lot of the types of bugs that could occur. It doesn't catch everything, but it helps out tremendously. Now, that Typescript advantage that you have in your front end is exactly why tests are even more important and part of the Ruby on Rails culture, is because Ruby is an untyped language, and therefore you don't really have a compiler that could automatically spot a lot of the types of syntax errors you would have. So I think the way that Ruby developers often work around this is by having very solid test coverage. Now, I've seen a lot of pretty big Java programs, and I've noticed that developers who work with a compiled language, if it's like a backend or an application, they feel that the compiler gives them a sense of security that the code is going to work. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of the math being done inside the business logic is correct, but at least the compiler, if you're using Java or like C#, will help you eliminate like syntax errors. But in Ruby, syntax errors happen quite easily because untyped, and there's a lot of metaprogramming. So it's very easy to change something and then pass in like the wrong type of hash into a method, and then when the program's at runtime, it will throw a runtime error. You'll get something like it can't process this particular hash key, or you passed in a string instead of a hash key or a hash key symbol or something like that. Those types of things happen in Ruby a lot, and good solid test coverage can help you spot those errors. I think another reason that most of your tests should be done on the Ruby on Rails side of your API application is because Ruby on Rails is closer to the actual database and the business logic. So that makes it a bit easier to mock up the types of scenarios that you want to test. You could set up like authentication scenarios. You could make whatever seed data that you need for that test to run. So for example, if you're doing a financial application, again, that's like a loan calculator, you could more easily mock up and insert different types of loan structures into your database, populate it, and then run the test there. Now, Ruby on Rails also has tools that could test your front end, and I've seen this used in situations, especially if Ruby on Rails is doing the full stack where you have like the templates being rendered. There's a tool called Capybara that what it would do is it would open up a mock web browser. It's called a headless web browser. And then what it'll do is it'll look for particular buttons or items on the HTML page and interact with them and see if the system gives you the correct response. Now, I think this might be a little bit unnecessary too, for the same reason that I think the front-end tests in JavaScript are kind of unnecessary, in that if it's like a user interface thing, those types of errors I think would be spotted pretty quickly. But a lot of developers in Ruby on Rails feel good having that test coverage there. And they'll use a tool like Capybara to mock different types of interactions on the web page. But the layer that I find most useful for testing with Ruby on Rails is with the Rails controllers, or if you're using GraphQL, you could test GraphQL inputs and outputs. Whatever that API structure is that you're using, you could mock up the web requests that the JavaScript frontend would send, and then send those web request data into your application and make sure that you get the correct HTTP response. And I find those tests to be very useful. Backend tests of your business logic are very important because sometimes business logic errors could be very difficult to spot. So going back to that loan calculator example again, what if you make a modification to your calculator code and then the loans start popping out incorrect financial figures? Well, that could be a big problem, and it could mean major losses for the business because the business logic is incorrect and you might be charging the wrong interest rates or something like that. And you certainly don't want that to happen. So a strong set of regression testing that tests every permutation of what could go wrong in your business logic data is very important. And those errors may not be very easy to spot right away, like with the front end, if like a button doesn't work. You could have a bug sitting in your back end for many months or years, and then comes along that one situation that triggers the right set of data inputs and outputs, and then your application is giving the incorrect problems, and that could cost your business a lot. So a strong backend test suite in Ruby on Rails using RSpec or Minitest can help you spot regressions related to that business logic early and right away before it goes into production. Anyway, I think the main idea behind what I'm trying to say is when you're writing tests for your application, there's a little bit of a trade-off of how much effort it takes to write that test versus the benefit that you get. So when it comes to front-end tests, I feel in general the benefit that you get for the amount of extra work that generates is not worth it in most cases. But for the Ruby on Rails test, because of the nature of the Ruby on Rails language, and because it's handling very critical business logic where you could have very subtle types of errors creep in your code, I think those tests are very important and require a lot of diligence and attention and care. Anyway, what do you think? What is your philosophy on writing unit tests or full integration tests for your application? I'd love to hear that. So go ahead and give me your feedback in the comments. And if you like this video, hit the thumbs up button, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more content on software development. See you next time.